So that's always the nice thing about writing your own bio, is you can say nice things about yourself. It's one of the few times that people say nice things about you. So can everyone hear me okay? I don't love having this gigantic microphone in my face, but it'll work for now. So as Dina mentioned, we're going to talk about outsourcing. We're going to talk about it really in two parts. And I hope you like this slide because it's the only slide you're going to see today. I've given you a handout which really covers most of the points that I'm going to cover, so you don't have to feverishly be writing throughout the whole presentation. But the reality is I find it's a lot more engaging both as a speaker for myself and when I'm a participant at one of these things where you just sort of sit and you get to listen and sit back and maybe formulate some questions. So I'm going to stop at a couple of points throughout the presentation and ask if there's any questions. So it may not be your standard, I'll speak for 50 minutes and then once you're fast asleep, I'll see if you have any questions. I'll stop a couple of waypoints and see if you have any. So I wanted to start today and talk a little bit about outsourcing because, I mean, obviously outsourcing could mean many things to many people, and I really wanted to start with a personal example of outsourcing because I actually outsource many elements of my business. So I have a large organization of one, yet I do a lot of outsourcing. I've got someone in Toronto that does my graphic design. I've got a web designer that's based out of Korea. I've got someone else that does my accounting and bookkeeping, right? I've got, actually the video guys and the photographers in the room today are local from Regina. I've got someone from Asia that's transcribing some teleconferences that I do. So just in sort of my own little microcosm of one person, I am a global organization, right? I'm outsourcing things to all over the world, depending on what makes the most sense for my business. And that's really what I want to talk about today, even in the two stages, is it really comes down to outsourcing what makes the most sense for your business, right? Outsourcing is everywhere. It takes lots of different forms. So we really need to look at it from a strategic decision-making perspective. It's not about trends. It's not about what's the latest thing. It's about what's the best thing to do for your business. And every business in this room is going to have a different answer to that question. What's best for my business? So if you look at sort of what the true definition of outsourcing is, the true definition is obtaining goods or services from an outside or foreign supplier, right? It doesn't mean outsourcing manufacturing to China or India or Eastern Europe. It doesn't mean outsourcing services to somewhere else. It means someone other than your own organization is doing something for you from a goods or a services perspective. So the reason I mention that is to really say, you know, I want to change the perception a little bit of what is outsourcing, because we typically think of outsourcing as it's got to go somewhere very far, far away in order for it to be effective. And what I'm saying is it doesn't have to go far, far away. It can go right next door, right? It's depending on what is most effective for your organization. It's a piece of your corporate strategy, as I said. You should only be looking at what makes sense for your organization. So, I mean, one of the things I do, I help companies save money and improve their bottom line, right? It's really hard for a company to say no to that when I start talking to them about it. But because of that, and as a part of that strategy, we look at what are some of the different factors that you have to think about. Managers, executives, directors, everyone within a company need to think of what are the different factors within the organization that you need to consider when you're going through a standard outsourcing, insourcing decision, which we'll call the make or buy. And that's really the first part. We'll talk about the make or buy. So, I mean, I've got some factors that we need to consider, but I wanted to do a quick audience exercise and really just get you guys to call out. When you're going through a make or buy exercise, saying, do we do this in-house? Do we outsource it? What are some of the factors you consider? Just sort of throw them up here at me. Is it core business? Okay. Other thoughts? Is it cost effective? Right? Is it part of your core business? Is it cost effective? Sorry. Does it have a union impact? Right? And we can make that even a little broader and say what's the impact on employees as a whole? Maybe unionized, non-unionized. Other thoughts? There's more than three, yeah.
I don't have to gear up for it because I can do it with somebody else. I don't have to pay that fee.
So, so you mean sort of startup costs and things like internal startup costs and things like that? Yeah. Was there? Right. Now, when you say capacity, what do you mean by that?
Manpower, space, physically all there.
Right. Manpower, space, all those kinds of things. Capability, right? Do we have all that, the ability to do any of that? Any other thoughts? Yep.
Like timelines and risks associated with letting someone else control parts of your business.
right? And you could even reverse that and say timelines and risks if you do it internally. That's why it's sort of an interesting conversation to have about make or buy, is because for almost every factor you bring up, you can argue one side or the other, right? And that's what I'll talk about in a few minutes, covering some of these things. Anyway, I'll take one more. Does anyone have one more? It's a purchasing managers conference. Nobody talked about cost? Did you talk about, okay, cost effective, yeah. Okay, so those are some of the factors you have to consider, right? I'm going to delve into each one a little bit more and just give you some insight based on what I've seen. So let's touch on cost first, right? It's the one that we all sort of tend to gravitate to right away. But when you're talking about a make or buy analysis, the first thing you need to look at, cost. And when I say cost, I mean you have to calculate the total cost, right? You can't just look, so if you're looking at it internally to say, how much is it going to cost us to make this particular component part or this product or provide this service? You have to look at the total cost. It's not just what are the labor costs, right? It's what are the overhead costs, the machinery costs, whatever it might be. Because if you're truly going to do an apples to apples comparison and you're going to say, well, it's going to cost me $250,000 to outsource this, I need to look at what is it actually going to cost me for the entire organization to do it internally. Because when you get that $250,000 quote from a supplier, they've baked in all of their expenses. You're paying $250,000. That's going to include their marketing expense, their overhead expense, their labor costs, whatever else might be baked into that quote. So if you really want to do an apples to apples comparison when you're talking purely about cost, you want to make sure that you're considering what the total cost for your organization is. And I apologize to you, sir, right there, because every time I move, I get blocked by the pole. So I'll try and stay over here. And then I block you. Okay. It's a no-win situation for me. Another one I want to talk about, intellectual property, competitive intelligence, right? So there may be situations where you've got your organization has certain intellectual property, certain competitive intelligence that you may not want to share, right? So that may even take one of the options off the table, meaning we don't want to outsource this because we may have to outsource it to a supplier that does work for some of our competitors, and sure, we might get non-disclosure agreements and you know, all the right agreements that we're supposed to have in place. But if they're doing work for one of our competitors, we're sharing competitive intelligence for our organization, things happen, right? The more people that know about your intellectual property and competitive intelligence, the more likely it's going to get out. And that's not to say don't trust your suppliers. That's by no means what I'm trying to say. Actually, I would say the opposite. You need to really trust your suppliers. But there may be certain situations where you've got leading edge technology and you just say, at this point, we're not willing to share that with anybody. We need to keep that in-house. So that intellectual property, competitive intelligence, what do you want, what do you need to retain from that perspective? Startup costs and ongoing needs. So speaking to that, and I put these two together because, again, it's really from an economies of scale perspective. You know, what are the startup costs? So it's important to know what those startup costs are. It's also important to know what are the ongoing needs of the organization. Is this going to be a one-time purchase or a one-time service that we need? Or is this going to be an ongoing need, right? Obviously, if it's an ongoing need, the startup costs become a little less or they become, you know, diversified over a period of time. So you need to look at that. Are some of these costs one-time costs, and it would actually be cheaper to make it in-house next time? So if you know it's going to be an ongoing need, you factor those two in together. Another one, revenue stream. And what I mean by revenue stream is if we get good enough at making this in-house, is this actually something we can sell to other people, right? So we get so good at producing it for ourselves that it actually becomes a competitive advantage for us, and we can actually sell it to other people. So it becomes another revenue stream that we can sell to others, maybe even our competitors. It's happened many times before, right? So it's not something that you want to discount so quickly to say it may not be our core competency, but if it's an essential need for our business, we may want to make it a core competency, and then we can actually become a competitive revenue-generating business out of that. We talked about staff availability, right? So I mean, the first and easy question to ask is, do we have staff that are available to do this, and do we have staff that are capable to do this, right? So if the answer is yes, then you start talking about, well, what are the constraints, right? And for those of us that work on some project-based initiatives, I mean, I used to do project management as a career, and I don't think I was, and this isn't a detriment to me, but I say it anyways, I've never been on a project that was completely done on time, right? There's always a little bit of a delay here. It ends, you know, it goes a week late, a month late, whatever it might be. Obviously, the bigger the project, the bigger the delay typically. So if you think about staff availability and we say, well, they're available, we anticipate it's going to take 3 months to make this product, to perform this service, whatever it might be. Well, what happens after 3 months if there's a delay? If you've got a 1-week delay, a 1-month delay in the development of the product, does that mean the staff are still going to be available, or do you have them earmarked to do something else? So it's not just are they available today to start the work, it's are they going to be available 3 months from now to continue the work if we need it. If we find that it's a revenue generating opportunity, we want to spin it off as a different business unit, whatever it might be. We have to look at all those different things. As a corollary of that is really opportunity cost. So I may have people that are available, I may have people that are capable, but from an in-house perspective, what else would they be working on, right? Am I taking them away from something that's more value added? So to go back to the core competency comment, if it's not our core competency and I'm taking valuable resources away from something that is my core competency, again, that's something that I have to consider. And sort of, I guess last, and there's lots more, but the last one that I have on my list is really warranty, in the sense that if you do it in-house, one of the things you have to think about is you now have to support it. So if it's a new system, if we decide we can outsource our new IT system, we can bring somebody in that does it, or we can build one in-house, do it ourselves. Well, if you build it yourself, you now have to maintain that system, right? Instead of being able to hire an expert and the systems firm that implemented it, they're now going to maintain it. And you're now saying if we build it in-house, we have to maintain it ourselves, right? So it's really that warranty perspective. And what do you do about making enhancements, making improvements ongoing? Because when you outsource something like, I'm using IT as the example, when you outsource IT, a lot of it is you're paying maintenance fees, and that leads you to upgrades and fixes and enhancements and all that good stuff. If you build it in-house, you've got to have your own plan out there to do that. Sound pretty good? Any questions, comments, thoughts? No? So, I mean, using the definition I started with about outsourcing and really meaning that it's really just hiring another company to do a good or service, I would say that pretty much every project I've been on requires some form of make or buy decision, right? So I don't look at it as saying it's a specific initiative and it requires a make or buy. Almost every project I've ever been on requires some form of make or buy decision, and frankly, some form of outsourcing. So even if you think, again, I'll step back to my project management days and say, I'm working for companies and they've got needs, project management needs, right? We're looking for a full-time project manager. Well, what's the first thing we do? We look internally in the organization. Is there somebody that has the capabilities to manage the project? Is there somebody that has the experience? Is there somebody that has the availability, right? But also looking at the other side to say, do we need to bring an outside resource in, right? I'm sure most, if not all of your organizations have brought in consultants at some point to do various things, right? Brought in other, HR people or systems people, IT people, whatever it might be. That's all outsourcing, right? It's looking at what are our capabilities, what is the specific need that we have to fill, and do we have people that can do that, or does it make more sense to bring in other people to come in and do that, right? And that's the way I define sort of outsourcing or the make or buy. So every project I've ever been on has required some form of decision, whether it's bringing in a systems company or just a single external resource, whatever it might be, there's always that conversation about, do we need to do it in-house? Do we need to bring somebody else in from the outside? I guess the one sort of piece of advice I'll give about that is when you're deciding on the buy, so we've decided we can't make it. Either way, scope is very important. Whether you decide to do it in-house or outsource, scope is very important. But one thing you want to be careful about is be careful what you ask for when you're going to outsource. You have to be very specific about the scope and what you're asking for. And I'll just give you a quick example, which is a small, easy example, which I never thought would have happened in a million years until after it happened. A client of mine was looking for a specific resource. I've had clients, whether it was a developer or a project manager, whatever it was, they were looking for a specific resource. That's all we wanted. We didn't need an entire large proposal from a large company. We just needed a single person that had these specific skills, this specific experience. So we put out sort of a form of an RFP, so to speak, really a job description posting for a 6-month contract, saying here's exactly what the person is going to be doing, here's exactly what we need. But the mistake we made was we didn't lay out the exact parameters of the response that we wanted back. We just sort of assumed that it was implied in the job posting, in the job description, that it was going to be sort of independent contractors or small firms that might respond, because we weren't looking for a whole methodology. We just needed a body, frankly, and a body that could do these things. So we got 11 responses back. 10 of them were sort of what we expected. A 3 or 4 page summary, a 3 or 4 page CV, resume, whatever it was. easy to review. The 11th response we got was a 77-page response with 4 different candidates and 65 pages of methodology. And of course, I mean, you have to do your due diligence. You've got to review the 77-page RFP response. This is in fact what it was for a very small project. But, you know, we had to go through it. I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, doesn't matter. We didn't end up picking them. It wasn't because they had such a large response, but it was because we asked for 1 person, they gave us 4, right? You have to be, my point being is you have to be very careful what you ask for, right? If you want a 3-page summary, ask for a 3-page summary. If all you want is a CV, ask for a CV. And I'm saying this in a smaller context, obviously. When we talk about outsourcing, it's a much bigger, broader scope. But my point being is extrapolate that out and say, imagine the issue we had on what was seemingly a very simple buying process, and now you're now talking about, you know, a 10-year, $150 million outsourcing arrangement, right? Think about the complications that can come into that situation. So again, the reminder being, think about what the different factors are, make sure that you're considering all those factors when you're making that make or buy decision, and then go with what's best for the organization. So I'll just take a quick checkpoint, and then I'll sort of move on to the outsourcing part. But any questions so far? Thoughts? No? Good pace? Bad pace? Okay. So when talking about outsourcing, I've got a list of sort of outsourcing do's and don'ts. But before I cover that, I want to talk a little bit about, most of you have probably heard of the Black Book of Outsourcing. It's a report that comes out, you know, on a fairly regular basis. Just because, and I only mention it because some of the numbers to me were staggering in terms of how big outsourcing is going to become and has become. And I'm talking about specifically procurement outsourcing in terms of these statistics. But, you know, last year in 2009, the Black Book of Outsourcing report said that procurement outsourcing is going to be the fastest growing back office area of business process outsourcing. So, I mean, that's good. It's a great statement to make, but what does that really mean? Well, the procurement outsourcing market in 2008 was about 700 million, meaning that companies like yours, or if you're a provider, that's a different story, you're making some of that money, but that companies are looking at doing procurement outsourcing in various stages to the market of $700 million in 2008. 2010 it was expected to go up to 1.1 billion, right? A significant jump in 2 years. And what they're estimating is that by 2012, it's going to go up to 3.5 billion. So we're talking about over 40% compound annual growth rate in procurement outsourcing. So what does that tell me? Well, first and foremost, for you guys in the room, it means there's huge opportunity out there, right? I mean, that's a huge market we're talking about. We're talking about almost a $4 billion market for procurement outsourcing services, right? It also means that there's a lot of companies out there that are recognizing maybe this isn't our core competency. Maybe procurement isn't our core competency. That may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but the reason I mention it is it's a trend that we need to be keeping our eyes on, right? Because this is a reputable organization and a reputable report that's coming out with fairly significant numbers. And I think what I'm finding in working with a lot of my clients is everybody knows that there's a lot of opportunity within the procurement space. Because, I mean, you know, you typically think of, and I'm trying to break my clients out of this mold, the ones that don't do purchasing for a living, because purchasing is actually a very strategic part of the organization, right? As you guys all know that, right? You do it every day. But purchasing is a huge part of the organization and can have a huge impact on the bottom line, right? So if you just think about it from and I'm going on a bit of a tangent for a second, but you know, you think about it from the perspective of if you're able to reduce your overall expenses and purchases by, let's say, 3 to 5% on the average business, that has a 3, 4, 5-fold impact on the company's bottom line because you're reducing the amount of money that's going out of the organization. So it has an exponential effect on the net profit of the organization, right? I mean, I worked with a company, it was about a $50 million company, and their purchases represented about, so it was about, I guess it was about 3 million or so. And we were able to reduce it by about 5 or 6%, but that money goes directly to their net profit because it's a reduction of 5% of $3 million on everything that they spend. They're not spending that money anymore, right? So not only does it go directly to their net profit, but it's also increased cash flow. I mean, there's lots of additional benefits on that, but the biggest benefit is that goes right to your bottom line, right? So I think that that's where I'm working with a lot of my clients to understand the strategic value of strategic sourcing, procurement, outsourcing, supplier relationship management, all the things that you guys are probably doing on a daily basis. But to understand that at an executive level, to say, this is where there's a lot, I don't want to even say it's low-hanging fruit, because it's not. This is where there's a lot of strategic value within your organization, because it goes directly from reducing your purchasing costs to your profit, right? There aren't many things that go directly to your profit. This is one of them. I'll get off that tangent. But my point being is that a lot of companies are starting to recognize that the procurement solutions are valuable to the organization, but they really don't know how to take the proper steps to maximize that value, right? So even the sort of basic steps of strategic sourcing, without people like you around, a lot of companies don't really know how to do it, right? So they need that value, they need that expertise to really get that maximum value. So to jump now to outsourcing, I want to talk about 10 do's and don'ts, in my view, about, obviously 6 things you should do and 4 things you shouldn't do around outsourcing. And you've got them in front of you, but I'm going to expand a little bit on each of them. So the first do, and I've touched on scope a little bit already, but I think that this is the most important aspect of really any outsourcing relationship, any outsourcing conversation that you have, is determine the scope of what is to be outsourced. It's the most important thing. So it's great to talk about outsourcing as a concept. And I think every organization should be looking at outsourcing as a concept and as a strategic value. But you have to look at it and say, what are we going to outsource, right? I mean, it's sort of a standard decision-making process that you go through. What is the specific issue that we're trying to resolve? Or what is the strategic value that we're trying to get? So taking a look at that and saying, what is the specific scope that we want to outsource, right? Which operations do we want to outsource? Which operations, if any, do we want to retain, right? And you look at all aspects of your business, right? Because you can pretty much outsource anything now. Like I said, for my business, the only part of the business I actually do is really the marketing and the consulting part. I've outsourced almost all other aspects of my business for the main reason, to touch on the core competency thing. My core competency isn't web design. It's not shooting videos. It's not taking pictures, right? My core competency is consulting with clients and hopefully speaking, but you guys will decide that. But it's really looking at what operations do you want to outsource, what operations do you want to retain, and the scope of any agreement you put forward should be based on the answers to those questions, right? What are the specific issues that we need to resolve? What are the specific values that we want to achieve? And then looking at different areas of the organization and saying, does it make sense to outsource or not? The second do is develop a business case. And what I mean by a business case, pretty straightforward, is really just doing your basic cost-benefit analysis. And to say, for any initiative you take, whether it's a change initiative, whether it's a new system, whether it's going to a conference, professional development, whatever it might be, there's a reason for it, right? You know the reason probably in your head, but when you do a business case, when you do a formal cost-benefit analysis, you're really putting that down on paper, and it forces you to think about, what is the reason I'm actually making this change, right? In this case, we're talking about the change being looking at outsourcing. What's the reason I'm doing this? What are the benefits to me doing this? What are the costs? And when I say costs and I say benefits, some of them are going to be financial, and some of them are not going to be financial. So it's really, I tie it back to tangible and intangible benefits. I think it's important to identify both, right? Because there's some initiatives that we embark on which may be cost neutral, but there's a lot of intangible benefits that we achieve by doing them. And those are very legitimate benefits. So analyzing the costs and analyzing the benefits, both from the short and the long term, right? So, typically what has tended to happen, at least in the last few years in outsourcing, when we talk about, let's specifically pick on manufacturing organizations for a second. A few years ago, everybody was saying we have to outsource all of our manufacturing to China, right? The unit cost is much lower, the quality is just about the same, but we're saving a ton of money on the bottom line because it's much cheaper for us to do that. So what's come out in the last few years? Well, there are some risks when you do that, right? Yes, there's no question there was a unit cost savings in most cases, but you had increased lead times, right? You had sometimes questionable quality. I mean, we went through a stint specifically in China a couple of years ago where we had tainted milk and we had tainted paint, and we were recalling every kid's toy that had ever been made in the last 4 years, right? So there's a bit of a loss of quality, or at least a loss of management control. But there's also additional costs that you incur. So you might have a unit cost savings. It costs me, $1 in Canada to make this pen, but it costs me 25 cents to make the same pen in China. But I've got to get it to my Canadian customers. I've got to get it to my US customers. That costs money, right? There's supply chain costs. There's carrying costs. There's warehouse costs. So it's important when talking about the business case that you're looking at all of those costs that may be incurred, and you're looking at it from the short term and the long term. Because in the longer term, it might be a little more difficult to get those unit cost savings than you do at the very beginning. You get that big jump right at the beginning. So that's what I call total cost of ownership. You guys have probably heard, most of you probably heard that term before. But that's what I mean by total cost of ownership. It's not just the unit cost savings. It's what other costs do you think the organization is going to incur as a result of doing this. It might be tariffs, right? Trying to get stuff out of the country. What about, just another thing about outsourcing is what about trying to get a contract actually enforced in some countries, right? We take it for granted here in Canada, you have a legal contract, 99.9% of the time that's going to be legally enforceable, and you're going to get what's coming to you. If you breach a contract, you're going to have to pay, and if your contract gets breached by somebody else, you're going to get damages paid to you. Well, that's not the case in every country, right? So that's another thing which I don't have on the list, but it's one of those, you just have to know where you're doing business and who you're doing business with. So the third do in outsourcing, research potential outsourcing providers. And I'm saying these, and a lot of them sound commonsensical, I understand that, but you wouldn't believe some of the organizations I've worked with that are fairly large organizations, fairly mature organizations, that don't go through a bit of a disciplined checklist when they're thinking about these kinds of things. Because it becomes the allure of saving tons of money by doing outsourcing. It becomes a quick fix to long-standing problems that they've had. And it's not. It should be a strategic decision. And again, I'm not standing up here saying you should or you shouldn't outsource. I'm saying you should be looking at outsourcing just as you're looking at insourcing as a strategic part of your business. So research potential outsourcing providers. I mean, I think it's important, you guys probably all do this on every RFP that you're a part of, but you want to talk to customers, right? Get sort of the ins and outs of the organization that you're potentially about to do business with. And ask the customers some tough questions. Because, if you think about it this way, for those of you that have been part of an RFP process where you've asked for references, and frankly, probably for everyone in this room that's ever gone for a job interview, where the potential employer has asked you for references. Well, have you ever given a bad reference on your own resume? Somebody asks for references, you're not going to give somebody that you know is going to say bad things about you. You're going to give references that you know are going to say positive things about you. But even those companies, so if you're looking at an outsourcing provider and they provide you a list of 5 companies, you've got to expect that those companies are going to give them positive marks. But even talking to those companies, you're going to find out some things that maybe you wouldn't have found out just by looking at the internet or looking at a report. Because you talk to these customers and you ask them questions like, sure, they were great at service. Did you get what you expected, right? You're now 5 years into this relationship with them. Are you getting what was promised on day one, right? They might say, yeah, we're getting most, so you're going to get some insight if you ask those kinds of questions. So you'll ask the standard questions, are you happy? How's their customer service? Do they treat you like a good customer? All those kinds of things. But if you start asking them some probing questions, did you get what you expect? Have they lived up to their end of the contract? Those kinds of things. Those are the important questions that even in asking a positive reference, you're still going to get some valuable insight. Is there anything that I should know that you wish you'd known before you signed the contract? That's a very powerful question because it'll force them to think, but usually every company will be able to come up with something. I wish I had added this clause, or I wish I'd known this, right? So researching those potential outsourcing providers, very important. Number 4, one of the things you should do, identify specific service levels to be met. Again, sounds straightforward. I've seen too many contracts that don't have specific service levels in them. Again, if you're entering into a long-term outsourcing, I mean, even if it's a short-term, low-cost one, but long-term, expensive outsourcing arrangements, you have to have service levels. And I think even more importantly to this one is not only having them, but making sure that you're managing them, right? So many times you see there's a great level, here's the great service levels that we're getting, but then you find out 2 years later people actually aren't managing those service levels. What happens if you as a customer aren't managing those service levels? Well, you're losing value out of your contract. It's supposed to be 98% accuracy, you're getting 95% accuracy. What's the impact to your business on that 3% of accuracy that you're losing in information? Like, without knowing any specifics about anything, I could say it's adding redundant work, rework, duplication of effort, all that stuff. As soon as accuracy and those kinds of things go down, there's an impact on the productivity of your organization. So again, making sure that you understand what the service levels are, how they're going to be measured, and making sure that you as a customer organization are managing those service levels. Number 5, developing a transition plan for the organization. And what I mean by this is it really can be twofold, because there are certain outsourcing arrangements where, frankly, the outsourcing company really just takes over the entire function of the company. So if you look at sort of a full procurement outsourcing transformation, that's really the situation where a procurement outsourcing company really takes over the entire purchasing function for your organization. And what happens in those instances, they actually take over the entire staff as well. So there really is a transition of staff from the old organization to the outsourcing organization. That's, I don't want to say that's the extreme case, but that's sort of the far end of the spectrum where there's a true transformation and transition of people from one organization to another. But anytime you do any type of outsourcing, there's going to have to be knowledge transfer. And I think it's important to make sure you've got a transition plan for the organization to say, how are we going to handle it, right? So identify how staff transition is going to happen. Even if it may not be I'm moving resources from one company to another, it may be how am I going to share knowledge? How are my resources going to work with the resources from the outsourcing company, right? It's that transition plan, that knowledge transfer, that knowledge sharing plan that says, how are we going to deal with this? You know, which roles are going to be moved to the outsourcing provider, if any? Which roles are we going to retain? Which roles become redundant? And those are strategic questions that you have to ask whenever you're looking at an outsourcing relationship to say, well, do we need to have duplicate work? Do we want to have duplicate work? Maybe, maybe not. But again, you need to ask that question. And the 6th and final do, which I've got on my list, retain someone to manage the relationship. So again, speaking from my project management background, one of the flaws I tended to see more often than not was through the procurement relationship, you select a supplier, you come up with a contract, and the supplier starts supplying whatever they're doing, whether it's a good or a service. And the person that negotiated the contract and the person that was responsible for getting the process to the end, which was the signed contract, more often than not tends to go away. They're going to work on other things. They leave the organization. For whatever reason, there seems to be no continuity between the two processes. So when I say retain someone to manage the relationship, if you've just invested 12 months of your life in helping to negotiate the scope of this agreement with an outsourcing provider, it makes no sense whatsoever for that person to then move on to something new, right? There may be a transition, but I mean, what I've found is like, okay, on day 366, the contract is over, it's signed, we start the new provider January 1st, and everyone that was on that team is dispersed and they go somewhere else. So there's no consistency. There's nobody around anymore that's dedicated full time to managing this relationship that has any background on why some of these things were decided, right? So if you got to pick up somebody else's contract and it's a 50-page contract identifying service levels and scope and all these varying things, and you weren't a part of that to begin with, I mean, aside from the fact that it's probably a very frustrating experience, I can imagine having been through it myself, but it's also a very difficult experience because you're trying to interpret things that somebody else wrote and somebody else decided upon. So retaining someone to manage that relationship is really important because these relationships can become time-consuming. They're obviously complicated. And it only makes sense to have somebody with the appropriate expertise to maintain some consistency and manage that relationship. So before I jump into the don'ts, any questions? Comments, thoughts? Is this consistent with what you guys are seeing in your everyday lives? Any insights anyone wants to provide? We can make it interactive. I'm okay with that. Yes?
Just curious as to where your approach would be to sell internally. And there's a lot of things that have to be the plan and presumably where you're coming from, where you're trying to sell.
So sorry, how I would approach selling internally?
You're going outside with something, it's a change in the organization. It's very substantial. It impacts people. It impacts operational space for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the demand for space creates the demand for outsourcing.
Mm-hmm.
So
So are you talking about how would I sell the change internally? So if I've decided we need to go to outsource, how do I get my organization to get on board? Is that okay? Well, to me, I mean, to simplify it, it really comes down to one question, which is what's in it for me, right? And I say that facetiously, but to me, with any change initiative, because like I said, whether it's outsourcing or anything else, there's always going to be internal change that has to happen. So if I can sort of take your question and make it broader, how do we implement successful change within an organization? How do we get people to support it? I mean, to me, there's two things. The first is you have to look at who are your major stakeholders, right? Who's going to be impacted the most by this decision, and who's got the biggest influence in this decision, right? And those both sort of answer the question, who are my key stakeholders? And then the second question, once I've established who the key stakeholders are, I look at each stakeholder group and I say, what's in it for them? And what I mean by that is, what are the benefits to them? There's always going to be benefits, right? You have to drill down. Now, sometimes the benefits may be at a corporate level, right? So how do you get an entire organization to say, well, I know that my day-to-day life is going to change and it may not be better, it may not be worse. But I know at a corporate perspective, there's going to be improvements, but you really have to be able to drill that down. So, I mean, everybody can understand the company's going to say, excuse me, the company's going to save $5 million, $10 million, $50 million, but what does that mean for me as an employee, right? So senior management has to be able to break that down and say, well, if we save $50 million, I don't know, your health benefits are going to improve. Your work days are going to be reduced. Your productivity is going to be, we'll be able to buy that new system you guys have been talking about. We'll be able to allow you to do more community initiatives because we're not going to be as pressed for time. You're not going to be working a 60-hour work week. Whatever it might be, you've got to tie and say, what are the benefits to each of those major stakeholder groups? And I think you also really, I mean, frankly, as sort of a third wheel or a third hub there, is you have to find champions within the organization, right? Who are influencers, both from the top level and the bottom level. So you sort of work it from the top and the bottom, but you have to find, it, for lack of a better term, ambassadors within the organization. Who are people that recognize the benefits that are going on, they're fully on board, and you've got to get them talking that up within the company as well, right? So providing them the tools and the information that allow all levels of the organization as supporters to be talking about that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Comments, questions? No? Okay, yes?
Yeah, one of the things with outsourcing is risk. I think you mentioned it. I think it kind of dovetails on the last question, which is how do you manage it? And a lot of the folks, stakeholders involved in the process are going to have objections. So you may want to think about how you're going to manage those objections before they come up.
Yeah.
Put a strategy in place to manage those.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So if everyone didn't hear, the point was there's always going to be risks that come up. There's always going to be objections that come up. So part of your strategy, your change management strategy, for lack of a better term, would be coming up with rebuttal, frankly, or ways to counteract those objections to say, well, yes, it's going to do this and this, but it's also going to do these three things which are beneficial to the organization. So I think it's important because I think if we sat down and we brainstormed about it, we could probably come up with all the possible objections that are going to come out, right? So it's not so much that the objections that are going to come out are new, it's that most organizations don't take the time to actually do that from a risk management perspective. Again, if you think about it from a project-based perspective, one of the things that most organizations do really well at the beginning of a project is identify all the risks, right? We sit down, we have a risk planning meeting, we say, here's the 15 risks that might happen, but what happens with that list afterwards? Sits on a server somewhere, it sits in somebody's computer somewhere. How often do you actually go back and readdress that? How many of these risks have actually become issues, right? How many of these risks can we sit down and actually put together a mitigation plan to say, because you don't want to deal with it when it's an issue. When it's an issue, it's already too late, right? You want to deal with it when it's a risk. If this happens, here's the 3 things we're going to do, right? So if we decide to outsource and 3 of our 4 C-level executives don't buy into it, what's the risk mitigation plan? Well, I'm hoping the CEO at least bought into it, so he or she's going to have to push very hard. But I mean, if we get significant resistance in the organization, what are the 3 things that we can implement to mitigate that risk? Think about it up front, just as you were saying, so that when it happens, you're just executing a plan. You're not scrambling to try and figure out why 80% of the organization doesn't buy in, and what are we going to do about it? Right? You've already got that mitigation strategy in place. Other thoughts? No, those are good points. Thank you. Yep.
All those that might be affected by the change, if there's an opportunity to do that, then have the ability, really good communication, letting people know
Nobody likes surprises. Yeah, I've always said this to my clients. I said, you know, I mean, it's their business, but I've always said that I'd prefer to get complaints from people that were communicating too much than not enough, right? I can always scale back on communications if I'm communicating too much, right? But it's really hard. Once somebody's coming to you and saying, we're not getting enough information, it's too secretive, it's not frequent enough, you've already started to lose a big group of people. If you're communicating too much, it's easy to say, okay, well, we're not going to do weekly anymore, we're going to do monthly, right? But we're still going to send out that valuable information. So I'd rather have people complaining, you're telling me too much about the company, than, you know, the secrets or people's perception of secrets. Because listen, nobody likes ambiguity, frankly. And nobody likes to not know the direction that they're going or how some big decision is going to impact them, right? We all want to know, and that's why I say that most important question is what's in it for me. Because regardless of how altruistic we all are or think we are, our first thought is, how are we going to be impacted? And that's not a bad thing, right? That's the way we think, right? How is it going to impact us? How is it going to impact my job, my family, my life, right? Those are natural thoughts. So why not, if you're the people that are responsible for implementing the change, why not just attack that head on and say, we're going to be able to answer that question. This is exactly how it's going to impact you. Okay, good. Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's jump to the don'ts. So I've got 4 don'ts in terms of what not to do around the outsourcing. Don't regard this as a quick fix to your procurement problems or your manufacturing problems or any organizational problems that you're having. And what I mean by that is just by outsourcing, it's not going to fix all of the managerial problems you might have or the procurement problems you might have or the internal cultural problems you might have, right? This is a strategic decision, and I've said it a lot because I truly do believe it. It's a strategic decision that should be bringing value to your organization. It shouldn't be to fix a problem. It should be because we've said there's a specific issue that needs to be addressed. There's specific value that we need to add to the organization. So we're going to do that. So you can't look at this as a quick fix. Sort of the analogy I always use is just clean up your own backyard before you move, right? You'll have less stuff to move. Right? So it's sort of the same idea. If you're looking at outsourcing, make sure that you're clear on exactly what you want to be outsourcing and the value that you want to receive back. Again, another analogy I always use about clients that want to jump right into buying a new technology system. Right? They want to automate their processes. Doesn't matter what the technology is, but they want to automate their processes. And I say to them, okay, but before you just go in and jump out and buy a new system and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and 18 months of your lives implementing this new system, we need to make sure that your processes are streamlined. Because all that happens if you implement a system that speeds up a bad process, what does that do? It allows you to make bad decisions faster, right? That's not good for any business, right? Frankly, if I'm going to consistently make bad decisions, I'd rather make them slower. At least then it doesn't exacerbate the situation, right? So I look at this as the same way and say, look at it strategically, clean up your own backyard, and then you look at where can this outsourcing strategy really add value to the organization. The second don't sign a contract that hasn't been reviewed by someone you trust. And I, again, commonsensical, but I've seen large organizations, some of them public sector, that you'd think know better because they're spending taxpayer money, go out and put their name on a very expensive long-term contract without it getting reviewed by the right people. Whether it be a legal counsel, whether it be somebody that's a business consultant that's done lots of outsourcing agreements, whatever it might be, find a trusted source because they're complicated, they're long, there's little wording in them that you have to be a lawyer who's practiced for 35 years to even understand what it says, right? And there's inherent risks in those contracts, right? So you try doing a long-term outsourcing agreement with a large company and not using their contract, right? They're going to insist that you use their contract. Why? Because it's been vetted through their legal counsel and there's risks and advantages for them within that contract. You need to understand what those risks are, right, before you sign any contract. Don't choose a company without a proven track record. So I guess I could reverse this and make it a do, which is do choose a company with a proven track record, but I wanted to even it out a little bit more, added a couple of don'ts there. But you want to make sure that when you're going to outsourcing, you've got somebody with a proven track record, right? Somebody that's done it successfully. If this is a big strategic decision for your organization, this may not be the time to take a flyer on a new company, right? I mean, if they've got strategic value, they've got intellectual property, competitive talents that nobody else has, that's a different story. But if you're looking at doing sort of your standard outsourcing, you want to look at companies that have done it and done it successfully, right? They've got it doesn't have to be a long list, but they've certainly got a list of clients that are happy, that are doing it. You want to try and find maybe companies that are from your own geography that are doing it, talk to them and say, how are they treating you? Again, going back to that conversation earlier about, talking to other customers and finding out valuable insight about the information. But you also want to be, if a company's been successful, you can leverage off their experience, leverage off their successes, right? It's only going to flatten your learning curve and make it a stronger relationship. And again, this sort of sums up all of it, but don't get caught up in the latest trend. And what I mean by that is, again, to reiterate, this is a strategic decision, right? This shouldn't be made on a whim. This isn't something we say, okay, today I'm going to wake up and decide we're going to outsource half the business, right? It requires a great deal of thought. There's generally a pretty large cultural shift within the organization. Even if you're doing small outsourcing projects, there's going to be impact and change within your organization. So it's very important to understand what's that impact going to be, and that it's not just a trend. Outsourcing is a strategic value that it can be brought to the organization. So I guess to summarize all 10 of those, outsourcing can be very beneficial. I mean, we've all seen and read about, probably some of you have your own individual stories about how it's been successful for your organization. But it becomes most successful when companies do their due diligence, right? And looking at sort of a variation or all of those 10 things that I just talked about is part of doing your due diligence, because it can help you identify areas of concern beforehand. So one of the things that I always stress with my clients, regardless of the area of consulting that I'm working with them on, is the more effort you put up front, the less effort and hassle that you're going to have to deal with afterwards. Because once you've got a problem, it's always more difficult and more time-consuming to resolve it than if you were able to anticipate that up front and say, here's the 3 steps I'm going to take if that happens. Again, it's really just, you could all tie this back to risk management. That's really what it all comes down to. It's risk management. So before I conclude, again, take a checkpoint, see if there's any questions, comments, thoughts. Anyone want to add anything based on their individual experiences? Nobody wants to share? I'm getting to be 10 minutes till lunch, so I haven't quite figured out if it's better to speak just before lunch or just after lunch. Because just before lunch, you're the only thing standing between an entire room of people and food, and after lunch, you've had a big pasta lunch and you tend to fall asleep. Yeah?
Here's one that I'm curious. Show of hands, how many companies have an outsourcing strategy?
So how many companies have an outsourcing strategy? We've got one, I think one, I'm going to count 2 because 2 people put their hand up halfway. So that makes 1 full person. So 2 people.
Do you do any outsourcing?
So how many companies do outsourcing? Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate it. I'll give you your $10 afterwards. Do you have a question? Yeah.
No, just a comment.
Oh, okay.
With every vendor or supplier that you utilize, that typically, the general principles that you apply to outsourcing, you can apply to all of those business relationships with your vendor or supplier.
Mm-hmm.
And managing the contract is so important.
Yeah.
I think we do enough of that in our own organization. Very, very critical.
Well, yeah. So the point being is managing the contract afterwards becomes very important. That's why I see sort of the tendency is we're going to put all these resources, all this effort towards getting a contract in place. And then, phew, now that we've done that, let's move on to the next project, right? And then what ends up happening is you don't manage those service levels, you don't manage that relationship, and 6 months later you can't figure out why your vendor doesn't show up anymore, right? It's because you weren't managing the relationship, right? So again, it's just sort of value that seeps out of those contracts, and it starts as a drip. But again, you can start taking liberties if you're not keeping suppliers on their toes in terms of, we know your performance level, right? We're keeping track of it, we're managing it, and we're going to hold you accountable because you're not the only supplier that can do this work, right? So if you're not getting us what we need, then we're going to find somebody that can. So just to sort of wrap up and summarize what I've talked about, the decision to outsource is really no different than any other strategic decision that you make, both really personally and professionally. I think the first question companies need to ask is, do we have the stomach for it? And I think we've seen, it sounds like at least most of the companies in the room are outsourcing, in some form of another. And I think, I gave you my personal example at the beginning, which I'm outsourcing some of the stuff that I know I'm not good at and I'm not interested in doing. To me, that's outsourcing too. So do I have an outsourcing strategy? Not specifically. I couldn't pull up a document for you and say, here's what I'm going to outsource and here's what I'm not. But as new things come up, I go through a bit of that internal decision-making process and say, well, can I do this? Am I capable? Is it a good use of my time? Are there others out there that can do it? Right? That's sort of the beginning of the process. So again, it's like I say, it's sort of your standard decision-making process in that there's a few basic questions that you need to ask yourself as you're going through this, because it doesn't have to be a complicated strategy. It's really answers to basic questions. What are the precise issues that need to be addressed? What is the specific value that we want to achieve? What are the alternatives? And I think that's, any decision-making process you look at, you have to look at, sort of what are the issues or value that needs to be addressed? What are the alternatives and what are the risks? Right? That's, what are the objectives? I'll sort of start that. So what are the objectives? What are the risks? What are the alternatives? You look at those three questions, that's going to give you a pretty complete picture of what you're looking to do. So what are the alternatives? Well, the alternatives are, can we do it in-house? Are we capable? Do we have staff available? Is it an ongoing need? Those kinds of things. Are there providers out there that can do it for us? Sometimes the answer might be no, right? I mean, you may not, in some situations, outsourcing may not be a choice. There may not be anybody out there that can actually do it for you. My guess is there's a company out there that can do anything. Anything and everything that you want, you'll be able to find a company that can do it. Did I think I'd be able to find a company in Bangladesh that would take 40 hours of teleconferences and transcribe it for me in a Word document? Never even entered my mind until somebody told me that it was out there, right? And about $20 an hour, which is a really good deal. So you look at what are the alternatives? What are the risks of either option, right? What are some of the mitigants for those risks? So again, looking at what are our desired outcomes, what are the alternatives, what are the risks? What decision-making criteria are we going to use? I think this one's always overlooked. We do it inherently in our heads, right? When we make a decision, we know what criteria we're using, but when you're looking at making bigger decisions, you have to formalize that a little bit, right? We just sort of do it, our brains process it and say, when we make a decision, we know what's important, what's most important, and we just sort of process it, naturally. But when you're looking at these bigger decisions where you're involving multiple people, multiple departments, multiple companies maybe, you have to look at what are these criteria and what are the most important criteria, and then do an assessment and say, what's the best alternative, right? Based on what our needs are, what our objectives are, and the alternatives that we've got and the risks that are out there, what's the best solution for us? So it really just creates and paints sort of a full picture for you so that you can make that choose the option that really best meets the needs of your organization. So that's it. I don't know if anyone has any other comments, thoughts, questions. Yep.
Maybe one point is, I always look towards outsourcing. First, I want to know what problem I'm trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what this happens. So, for example, I would often look at it as a fixed procurement problem.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not a quick fix, but
Mm-hmm.
I always start with, no, this is my problem. Now I'm find a way out of this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone didn't hear the comment was, normally the first step is looking at what's the problem that needs to be fixed, what's the issue that needs to be addressed, right? Does that summarize it? Okay, other comments, questions, thoughts? No? Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to thank you all. I think Dina's got a quick closing, but enjoy your lunch. I will keep you no longer.